right. Hello and welcome back to discussing Schaeffer's How Should We Then Live? At this point, I just pull up the title of How Should We Then Live over on the sidebar so that I just get it right every time now. And in this one, this is where I start to feel a little out of my territory. So the scientific age and the age of non-reason, I feel like I've swam in those waters. I was born and raised in that culture. And like I've said before, Schaeffer really went from historical observances to kind of modern observances, and then combined in there, it started bleeding into like prophetic nature. Like it sort of felt like he was observing things now that would unfold, and he was sort of making observations about how that might happen. And this may be, fragmentation. I feel like I know enough and I see it in culture, but I'm really going to be asking a lot of questions, I think, in this episode and relying on Gabe, JD, and Dan. But Dan, give us our overview, our key points, and kick us off with the age of fragmentation that follows non-reason.
Yeah, and so all of these series is, every time I review them, again, I've shared a number of times I've taught these, and I put together a set of notes literally every time I watch it. And so even as you say an overview, I'm not doing a perfect outline, which is, by the way, John, you can tell everybody, right? There is an outline. There is an actual outline listed underneath the YouTube actual episode of You're Watching Schaeffer. That 30 minutes you're watching Schaeffer, there's an outline underneath there, very much proper for the segment. I'm just highlighting some things that I see that want to start the conversation that, strike me. And so there's no question this one really fits with the last one. First of all, to your point, John, quickly, what Schaeffer is doing here is so fascinating. You could say he's prophetic in a sense of like he sees the future, but he's really just reflecting on 2,000 years and watching how the ebbs and flows always go. And what's really interesting is he is straddling the fence from modernism to postmodernism. Nothing in his writing, he's talking about postmodernism, but if you actually read it, he's talking about postmodernism all the time. It's really fascinating. So he's straddling that. I would just, to your point. The other thing I would say, though, what he begins with in this session that speaks, not that we're talking personally about Schaeffer that much, but it does speak to Schaeffer, and it speaks to this whole episode. He talks about the pain of man. He's entering into critiquing what's going on, but he's saying with great compassion, which is what he was known for. He would say, if we really believe human beings are created in the image of God, if human beings are what we say they are, the most humanism, not humanism, but humanistic people on the face of the earth should be Christians. We should highly, highly esteem human beings and relationships and care and compassion and a broken heart over what we're seeing. And that's really what this is, age of fragmentation. He's talking about the actual pain that people experience because of this. So we could talk about the philosophy part of it, but he's not attacking anybody. He's going, this is real. Look at this fractured reality. And that's what he gets to here. Really the ramifications of this. You have an alienated, it's the word I use a lot, alienation, a fragmented human being. And John, really, we've been saying it, but while you didn't connect this dot, I'm sure you have, I've talked to you about this, but the whole sexual ethic machine that's taken off is absolutely this. It's completely a fragmented individual individual personality, and it's out of control to the point transgenderism, speciesism. It's going to keep going, and it's a complete alienation of what a human person was actually created to be. And so that's where we're really, in a real sense, to me, where I see it playing it out all the time when I look in culture. Yep, there's the fragmented person. The young boy that was created by God to become a warrior, to become a man, and something is being stripped away from him. And it's a tragedy to me. It makes me sad. It's not you're bad, I'm good. It's no, this is terrible. This is sad. This is destructive. so want it to stop, you know. So age of fragmentation, yeah, and then you end up in the absurd. You lose music, you lose. I mean, any noise, you lose everything. It's pretty out there for you to see. It's pretty amazing. A guy sits at a piano, puts on his little watch. I figure he actually has a name for that song. I forget what it was, 24 seconds or 60 seconds or whatever it's called. John Cage, and then people applaud or something like it's music. Unbelievable. But that's what you end up with. That's what you end up with. So I'm going to let it go at that. We can jump in. I think this really does just show the ramifications of what happened on the prior episode, really. And it's what we're in. It's what we're living in. So go ahead, man.
I want to jump real quick and just kind of point out for anyone who is a young person, a millennial, whatever, watching this, someone who is so highly praised in our culture, like young people's culture. I don't know, at what age he stops, but there is a podcast called This Cultural Moment put on by a pastor named John Mark Comer. And much of what he was addressing in at least one of the seasons of that podcast series was deconstructionism and the fragmented person, and he dealt with all of this stuff. But what I think is so interesting is that, like, for us young people, we think he is some, original new thinker. And Schaeffer died in the 80s and is dealing with these exact same conversations. So to any young person who's watching this, I encourage you to go listen to John Mark Comer, what he's saying, and come and listen to what Schaeffer is saying, and you'll see this is not a new thought. So that's just an encouragement for anyone who's younger watching this.
John, what year were you born?
I was born in 94.
Okay, I was born in 84. Gabe, when were you born?
76.
Dan?
60.
Okay, so we're spanning a couple different decades here. I'm just curious, all of our ages.
Yeah, no, JD, I don't remember again. I kind of lose track, but that's one of the fascinations why I wanted to have this conversation with you guys. And I actually wanted people that want to anyway listen in, because isn't it fascinating when we have Sam, because Sam's the same age as John, we have all of these decades here. We're listening to this guy who really, when he's speaking, is pretty much, say, 1980. I mean, I think he passed away in 83 or 84. So, he's running in the 70s, and we're all resonating with these same truths as we sit here. That's part of that idea of the scales off to me. This is part of what's so fascinating to me. I can sit with you guys and you guys kind of like get it, maybe different terms, different applications, different things, but it's the same stuff. And it's like, absolutely. And especially we'll get to in the next sessions, where Schaeffer kind of makes his prediction. He kind of sits there and says, I think this is what you're going to see happen. And it's like, oh man, we're swimming in exactly what he saw. But it wasn't because it was like an antenna out that went beep, 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 and God sent a message. It was like, no, looking at real knowledge and real content and looking at the ebbs and flows, this is the natural movement of where this is going to go. You can kind of predict it. So anyway.
Yeah, John used the word that nobody says fragmentation anymore. They say deconstruction, right? That's the term that's been used across culture in a positive sense. We need to deconstruct everything that's out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, could you or Gabe define that then, for the sake of people listening? There's some people listening aren't even used to that term. It is kind of an academic term, a kind of a postmodern term, So
yeah.
So how would you define it, John? Gabe, you add to it or redefine it or something, or?
John's looking it up.
I was gonna say I'm gonna take a Google definition for anyone watching. A method of critical analysis of philosophical language which emphasizes the internal workings of language and systems, the relational quality of meaning, and the assumptions implicit in expression. And then basically, like, the more simple version is it's a criticism theory.
Yeah.
And that's like connected to what I would say is another postmodern word of critical theory, which is to critique. The whole point is to critique and deconstruct, meaning like take construction and do the opposite of it. So like look at the inner workings of parts. That's what that definition just said. Like, look at how parts operate and then remove them all and unbuild a thing to the point where all you are left with is parts. And then at that point, quite honestly, and this is something we'll talk about in this episode, at that point, you can just elect to have freely sitting parts, or you can choose to reconstruct and try and rebuild and reassemble. But I don't know.
And that's good. And a couple things I would stress too is that it kind of goes back a few episodes to where everything's just a machine, right? You're just a part. And so where society has constructed this, so we can then take it apart and reconstruct it in a way that we think is better. Or it's the part of the video where he's drawing a circle and then says, oh, nope, not that one. He draws a new circle. And then, nope, not that one. It just keeps going. Well, it's the same expression of that, right? And there's also a piece to this where anything prior is wrong, right? It's critical of anything previous to us. There's no wisdom. There's no, everything's bad, right? Our country was founded on slavery or patriarchy, or pick your example, right? And so we're on this path towards future utopia, and therefore everything behind us has to be bad.
Yeah. And actually, David,
Good.
oh, I was just going to say, in Gabe's example, the whole circle drawing thing, deconstructionism is that last one where they just don't draw a new circle.
Yeah. Or another thing that goes with this, a couple ideas that float with it, and I think it fits all the age of fragmentation, and I don't want to get too far off on just postmodernity and this whole thing. But along with this deconstruction then is a skepticism, a high skepticism that there's been a power play.
Yeah.
It's why, so we don't really know truth. Remember, we've lost that. Now, God's not on our picture, so we're kind of caught between these two things. We really don't know what to do. And so truth is what's true for you, may not be true for me. So we really don't know what truth is. And then if we're going to dig at truth, we can't really get there because we realize that, like, I'm a big white guy and I came to a certain truth because of my color and my background or ethnicity or whatever it may be. I really didn't come to a truth that's available to everybody. I came to my truth. And then if I'm the dominating, let's say, ethnic group or gender or whatever in a society, I've put that power play on everybody. And I've basically forced everybody to adopt my truth that I came to through my bias, through my subjectivity. And we need to deconstruct that whole thing. So we say, well, the reason he says that is he is, or she is, or that's the reason they come to that conclusion. It isn't just because it's right. So that's all important. That all fits with the deconstruction.
To go off Gabe's point, the chronological aspect of it, of seeing what came before as inherently wrong or inferior at best.
Yeah.
I think that captures a little bit what we talked about last episode, that angst, that we need to find a target for this angst and blame someone else for the reason why we feel the way we do. And so to say, you know what, if all the people in power, the people who came before us, would have done things differently, I wouldn't be feeling this angst. And so I think this deconstruction can somewhat be, for some people, an exercise in dealing with that angst, that this is going to be the solution. If we can tear this down and build something better, that will solve our problem. And I think that it's always aimed at someone else because, you know, from a biblical perspective, you know, we're in denial about the fact of what the real problem in the world is. The real problem is our sin nature and its consequences. And so, but we want to find a different target to blame. So that takes you back to the garden, takes you back to shifting the blame to someone else. We know we have a problem, and then we're trying to solve it ourselves, and it isn't usually helpful.
And what you just said too, JD, the individual self, you know, like this is something, it took me going to, you know, years worth of Christian counseling for this to really like break through in my mind, how often we lose individual responsibility when we try to assert another person as responsible for our own actions and behaviors. And I actually had it said to me, and I don't want to go too far down a hole, and I also don't want to, you know, offend someone unnecessarily here, but I actually had someone say to me somewhat recently in a conversation, regarding the Ahmaud Arbery instance, which is tragic and a different conversation in its own right. But I had someone say to me in regard to that conversation that, and this was a black friend of mine, say, well, black people wouldn't be mean if not for instances like this happening. And this is not me, trying to make a commentary about that specific instance, but those are the sorts of comments we all make concerning our own personal sin or problems, where we say, I wouldn't be a certain way if not for this person outside of me causing me to be this way. And JD, that's exactly what you described as, the original Genesis problem, which was that, hey, I wouldn't be sinful if only that person wouldn't be sinful. And I think it's interesting how broadly that has played itself out into society.
I think, and again, I'm no art critic and I'm way out of my depth here, and Schaeffer was really complimentary in terms of the skill and ability displayed. But I think underneath the surface, there's also there, to go back to Genesis, this fragmentation, you can't deny that part of it is rebellion against God, which is, God, you're the one at fault. And our angst and it's God, it's this woman you gave me, or it's this world you created. And there's this fundamental rejection of, you can't tell me to color inside the lines. And you can't define for me what's reality. I'm going to define it for myself. And so I think that in some ways, some of what you see there, not all of it, but is both a consequence of their philosophy, but also an expression of just a new kind of expression of this individual, like, I'm going to define what's real for myself and not conform to anything. And so it's this sort of radical expression of that, of really rebellion against God. Which again, Genesis 3, like, so many things go back there.
Yeah.
Well, and what's interesting, JD, you started the prior session talking about this, how you kind of want it both ways, and Schaeffer brought it up here. They live a full expression, if you will, like John Cage, he used him as an example, this full expression of fragmentation. There is no content, there is no truth. I can make it any sound I want. But when it came to collecting and eating mushrooms, he knew the difference between poison and non-poison. And so it comes back to my drawing earlier. God created a real world. This is one of the emphasis in this whole thing. We can't get out of this. God's created a real world that works a certain way. And we don't get to say, well, I don't like the way it works. You can, I shouldn't say it. God in his dignity to a degree lets us have, you could have that debate theologically, but he lets us have a freedom or a dignity to go do that. But to your point too, Gabe, earlier, it just puts more chaos in motion is what it does. And
so John Cage is more than happy to rebel against assumptions about beauty. So to say harmony and rhythm and all those things, I'm going to throw those out the window. But he doesn't really have the liberty to rebel against principles of biology in terms of certain toxins in mushrooms. So he has to play by the rules over there.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's the point. It's like it's a pick and choose. So what struck me, JD, when you said earlier, Genesis 3, this is what strikes me. This is what we do, right? Like, we live in a real world, so we're locked up in a real world. We want justice. We say we don't want justice, but we would if it was leveled at us. We'd want somebody to treat us morally. We'd want somebody relationally not to use us. But then we turn around and in a schizophrenic almost way, we turn around and apply it differently in a different scenario when it somehow apparently doesn't affect us. But at the end of the day, it does affect us. There's a fragmentation and an alienation that unfolds.
Yeah.
But again, all of this goes all the way back. You either start with God and God spoke and God gives us the way of thinking, or you start with autonomous man by himself. There is no God. And this is where it leads. That's the issue.
The irony, for anyone watching this, go back and watch the beginning of episode 7. Dan broke down the transcendent and the immanent and why God brings that together. And the Christian God, Jesus specifically, why he brings that together. I find it so interesting that Schaeffer chose to use the word resolution as the, you know, the word of choice for describing how those two worldviews come together in the person God of Jesus. And Cage, you know, JD, you were describing his music as an expression of his Genesis 3 rebellion. And I find it so ironic that God is the perfect example of resolution between the immanent and the transcendent. And Cage, with his music, deliberately avoids and fights resolution, any sort of resolve in music, which is what we all love so much. You know, that's why when you pull up to your house, you'll sit in the car. If you're on the last 10 seconds of a song, you'll let the last 5 to 10 seconds finish. You know, maybe that's just me, but it just, you know, the music resolves and your brain is at peace, and there's order in the world. And Cage was rebelling against even that.
No, think of that construct again. Here's your construct, okay? There's a unit. Let me use the term I used last time, and then I did the PowerPoint 2 or 3 sessions ago. It's all the same thing. I keep trying to emphasize the same thing. Think of Bach and what he developed. Think of symphony, okay? It's a unity. It's all the same beautiful music with all the diversity, and it comes to resolution. It all fits together. See, that's the point. In contrast to that would be a cacophony, just a bunch of noise that doesn't have any resolution. And in the end, what it actually leads you to is what he talked about Bergman in his movie. It brings you to silence. There's nothing. Silence is no different than a bunch of noise. You don't have anything. You see how that works? So really, when Bach did what he did, it was an expression of this truth of God, and even you know, I mean, he acknowledged to the glory of God. He was able to bring together unity and diversity with resolution. That's the point. It's really fascinating, really. In our lives, on an individual level, that's what our lives should be like. There should be this fulfillment and this maturity and this sobriety, and that's what the Bible describes as sanctification. Like this whole life relationally, in the content of truth, it all fits together.
I feel like this was probably one of the episodes, maybe when I opened this episode with the intro, I said this was the one I felt, I think, least comfortable with, and in terms of like confidently understanding maybe what he was getting at. I think part of that is because this may have been the most art-oriented episode thus far. So maybe to someone else who's watching that's intimidated, any of the three of you, maybe describe, you know, we're talking about Cage and his inability to play his music, but then go pick mushrooms the way he wanted or whatever. Or the one at the end, Bergman, who ended up like signing the paper to say it was an atrocity or whatever. So I feel like those are all kind of confusing or like out there or back there in history examples. Maybe explain to me how I'm seeing fragmentation in my week this week. Where do I see fragmentation today?
Fake news.
Okay.
I mean, that's one example that came to mind pretty quick. And he talks about, I wrote this quote down, or a loose quote. As modern man leaps into unreason to find optimism without reason, he loses categories for moral and human values. He loses the ability to tell the difference between dream and reality. Yep. And I don't know about you guys, but it's pretty difficult to tell what actually happened and what's truth today in the news or common events, whatever, right?
Yeah.
You don't know because there's a different perspective on every one of those.
Yeah. Yeah. When you say fake news, put some skin on that, would you?
You mean like an example of what fake news is?
Yeah. How do you mean to put skin on that quote there about we jump to unreason for hope?
Well, everything that, let's take the president, for example, everything that he says, I think the way I've heard it explained is there's two movies on the same screen, right? It just depends on your viewpoint as to what he says, what he meant by that, what the words of the quote really were, right? You can find whatever you want him to mean through what he says, depending on which side of the issue you find yourself on, right? I mean, you'd think a global pandemic, we'd be pretty united, but people want to make comparisons of this to, World War II or something like that. But I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure we were a little bit more united during World War II than we were right now, right? There was a unified effort underneath to support the fight, and we have anything but that right now. So yeah, the fake news thing is just something that was tossed out after 2016 maybe, or even before that, as far as how to blow off what one side or the other is saying. Oh, that's just fake. There's nothing to that.
So you have a fragmented news stream and you have a fragmented society.
Yep.
Yeah. JD, do you have, or JD or Dan, do you have any examples of, like, as I move about my day or my week?
Well, I've given you a big one that, is driving the whole culture right now. The fragmentation.
Sexuality.
Yeah, I think that's a big place that's playing itself out. Think about, apart from getting into the individual person who's struggling or dealing with this sort of thing and relationships, let's remove all that a minute. This thing is a driving force. It's unbelievable when you think of actual percentages of people who participate in that kind of a life or vice. And then you look at it's driving, the film industry, and it's driving education in the school system. And it's like, this thing is huge. It's like
but it's not. You're saying it's a really small percentage.
People, but the voice, or it's like this megaphone that's changing everything. And it changed the entire, think of this, thousands of years of a context of a husband and a man and a woman coming together in marriage. We literally redefined it, like defining a circle as a square. You literally came up with a new definition. It changed. It's one thing if two people want to be together, two men, two women, we can have a conversation about that, but we literally are redefining our culture in a sociological, cultural, political way, just all of life based on this issue. That's what I mean. I think it's in our face every single day. And it's going to get to the point, and it is to the point, that if you don't agree with it, you will be breaking the law. You will be, there's going to be a price to pay for saying, no, I don't agree with this line of thinking. So I think it's huge.
Yeah.
What's
sexuality.
What's interesting about it is if you look at it as gender as a social construct, right? Which was a very common phrase used years and years ago. Actually, it's probably still current now, but I remember having specific discussions about this with some college students. There's some truth to that, right? It's not, there is a little bit of normality as far as what we say male and female should be expressed like, based on how society raises those two different sexes, right? And so there's a hinge of truth to this deconstruction aspect, is that we really have constructed a lot of this stuff around us. Now, the reason we've done it the way we've done it is because of, you can then trace those things back like Schaeffer's done. But there is a bit of truth that we're not hardwired to go one specific way. We're not robots, right? There's choice. There's ability to make changes to construct as we want. And the issue is then, how are we going to now live, right? How are we going to decide to construct the things moving forward?
Yeah.
I think the other thing, John, and maybe it's not helpful, but I would say this probably is moving to the major application of this, and it's a big part of this, is that even when these men enter into this, men or women go to the logical conclusion of their fragmentation, and they accept their fragmentation, if you will, without even using those terms. So you got Cage as a primary example. You have these films as primary examples. They can't live in a real world like that. It's very what's the word I'm using for it? Help me, guys. It's applied where they want to apply it, but it's not. They don't live that. And in light of that, what I want to say is that God has created a real world. And so the example used, Schaeffer gave this example one time, not in his film, but in some of his writings. It's like going into an attic and you find a book with pages tore out. They're tore down the middle, the corners tore out, letters, words missing. That's like the world you and I live in. And then you happen to find this little box with all these tore pages, and the pages actually perfectly fit back into the book. Well, that's the revelation of God, the scriptures of God. It's like he's created a world and put it into place. If you sit here and observe it, you can see why do we treat people different than we treat animals generally? We don't stop and call 911 for a possum alongside the road, but we would if we saw a person. So there's something obviously inherent in all of us that we know human beings are different. So why do we do that and treat them with dignity and differently, while at the same time we do really cruel things to people? That would be the question. So everybody can see that. Well, isn't that fascinating? You could come up with that question, and then you'd look at God's revelation, and he explains it, right? He tells us, here's the inherent problem. You have a broken nature. You are fallen. You're depraved. We have terms to put with that. Where you are sinful. You're alienated from God, and so it's broken something in your soul. The scriptures explain it. That's the point. And so these men are following in certain areas of their life to the natural conclusion, but they really don't live that way. They don't live that way. So I'll give you one example. I was sitting on a plane, and I don't know if this is even answering your question, John, but I was sitting on a plane coming back from a trip in Africa. I was sitting with a physician, really neat guy, and anesthesiology guy, if I remember right, or something, brain surgeon, whatever, young guy, married, had a daughter. We had this wonderful conversation, but he had come to the conclusion we were just machinery. We were just chemical piece, some kind of repository of chemical whatever, and whatever spits out of us is just chemical. So I just started asking the existential questions, JD. I said, so what do you say when your daughter jumps in your arms and says, I love you, Daddy? Is it just chemicals, or is there really a real girl in there who really loves her daddy? Or is it just the chemicals? And then he kind of rambled around a little bit. Nice guy, again, not antagonistic. We had a wonderful conversation. But here's the kicker. I said, so if you got on the side of the cliff, what difference would it make if you threw her off or you hugged her then? Well, he said, honestly, it probably wouldn't make any difference. He actually said that. He said, I just hope the chemicals tell me to hang on to her and not throw her off. I just thought, wow. And he had attention. He was telling me, I ended up by sending him a note on some books and an email. I never heard back, so I don't know. But I had a wonderful conversation to talk about the reality of the gospel with this guy. And but isn't that interesting? Like, he was following it to the conclusion, but man, what a way to live.
Well, which artist? It was Picasso, right? Who would paint his daughter and his two like female partners, like I don't know if they're wives or whatever, but
as real people.
Well, yeah, and I mean, he would really technically the times that he painted them as real people were failings, because he would paint them as abstract, deconstructed beings, but then at times he would fail to live coherently with his deconstructed abstractionism, and he would paint them as real beings, and even that, that's a good example of the chemicals thing, where it's like he wants to believe that it's random and deconstructed, and yet like they're not capable of living in that reality.
Yep.
And I think a lot of people who have embraced some of these ideas and live according to some of these ideas, they're not fully aware of it and conscious of it the way that some of these artists and filmmakers are, and musicians. Like, these guys are unique in society, and the fact that they have sat back, and Gabe, you spoke to this earlier, had the time to sit around and actually think about these things, and they've attempted to communicate them and to portray them through these different mediums. But most people aren't like that. Most people are going to work, trying to pay bills, living life. But these artists, I think, are unique in the sense that we see sometimes in their own life sort of a microcosm. You see an arc, their story. Sometimes it ends in suicide or despair. Sometimes, like I think you mentioned T.S. Eliot came to faith in Christ. You see a change and a shift in his writing. But I think we see a microcosm in the lives of some of these unique people with unique gifts of what happens to society over a much longer period of time. It's slower for a whole society to be affected and for the consequences of ideas to fully sink all the way to the bottom. But we can see it sort of condensed and concentrated in the life of some of these individuals. So they're unique, not because I think they're very aware of what they're doing and why they're doing it, and even trying to live that out. And they're experiencing the fact, whether it be picking mushrooms, painting a family member, or ending in suicide. They're experiencing how that doesn't work. It's not sufficient. But it takes a longer time for a society or a culture to sort of experience that same story arc, and it often ends in bigger consequences than it does for an individual person's life.
That's good. That's good, JD. I think in the series, Schaeffer called that the sensitive man. I think he was using that word as sensitive to describe what you're describing, kind of very aware and intuitive and watching and observing and experiencing deeply, and now trying to express that in some medium of, music or painting or something, right? So can we pull it together then, guys, here? You had something, Gabe, or somebody?
I was just remembering that Os Guinness book from a few years back, Fool's Talk, where he talked about everybody has to come to that two poles, right? There's a distraction pole and a dilemma, I think was the other one. That's how we appease. You either have to come to the end, like a lot of these artists have done, and then we see what the consequences are, like JD was describing, or we just see their answer on the screen or whatever, or you distract yourself. We have so many distractions right now. I think that's something that keeps artists, I think, a little bit unique, that they actually kind of tend to deal with the dilemma a little bit more than the average person.
Yeah. So just as I have just one fast conclusion as we try to move this to a close, if we can. I like it. He just sat there and in his way of crossing his legs and talking, he said, the Bible's not romantic. There's no need to be pessimistic. Our worldview is that life is going somewhere. Yeah, there's a journey here, and we're on a movement, and a sovereign, all-controlling God is behind the scenes of this whole thing, beyond anything we could know, and we need to respond to who he is and his revelation in light of this. And so I'd be open to hearing what you guys then, how then shall we live, right? What would you guys add?
Yeah, I think he finishes that off with history is going someplace. There is an end. Yeah, and it strikes me that we don't have societal agreement on the eschatology, right? Where we're going. So there's no way we can come up with a way to live right now if we don't have an agreed upon. You're going on a family trip and all six of you want to go to different places. That doesn't end real well, right? There has to be an agreement on this is where we're going. Or somebody has to take charge and say this is where we're going. That's a dangerous option as well.
Oh yeah, and it might not always be thought out, but everybody has an eschatology.
Yes, absolutely.
Keeping an end view in mind, and right. So what we're seeing right now politically or socially in our life right now, I've noticed that. Like, I see death. I just talked to somebody about this morning. It's all about risk. These states, it's all about risk and fear.
Yeah.
But in my worldview, I see death as an awful thing, but it's not the end to me. It's just a chapter that moves me to the next chapter, right? I don't like
a lot of things than death.
Yeah, right. And so therefore, there's certain risks I'm willing to take going, oh, okay, well, I'm not making light of that, right? But like death doesn't hold. It's not part of my eschatology in the sense of me thinking that's the end. Mm-hmm. But if it was, see, this is where I've always appreciated Francis Schaeffer. And again, even atheists that he would have discussions with said they loved the guy, because if you really thought your eschatology, the end is physical death, the risk and fear of everything we're seeing in here would be so heightened. Mm-hmm. And you have to have compassion for the person that's walking around feeling that way, because they really are. They are terrified that they're going to get this thing and die tomorrow. Yep. Which they really are. Global warming is the same way. All these things are. If all you had was this earth and you're afraid of it being destroyed, you'd be totally paranoid about any evidence that said we're destroying it.
I appreciate what you said, Gabe, about eschatology. That is part of the Christian worldview, and one that doesn't get enough attention, or it gets the wrong kind of attention. Right. But really, the Christian worldview is, and something I've told my church in teaching on eschatology, is the Christian worldview is simultaneously more pessimistic and more optimistic than anything else the world has to offer, because we actually have a worse end than you can imagine with, you think of any sort of secular apocalyptic vision of what this world could turn into. You think about annihilation or extinction, anything like that. To think of an eternal hell where the wrath of God is poured out, that's worse. At the same time, the best human utopia you can imagine with the best increases in science and healthcare, with the most human harmony possible, governmental harmony, whatever you want to call it, that pales in comparison to a renewed creation where Christ reigns in perfect justice. Like our worldview actually has more pessimism in terms of depravity and judgment and rightly understanding our problem and its destination, and more optimism in terms of what Christ is accomplishing and redeeming his people and renewing the creation. We have something that encapsulates the whole. So I think people in this world, they tend towards either more optimistic or more pessimistic, but it can't really encapsulate everything. And biblical Christianity just does.
That's great.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
And so to your point, Dan, I've had this conversation with people, there's things worse than death, and there's things worse than this virus. Jesus says, don't fear those who can only kill the body.
Yeah.
But we fear him who can destroy both body and soul, referring to eternal judgment. So there's bigger fish to fry than dealing with the virus. And that just shapes how we live day to day.
Yeah.
The kind of risks we take and don't take, and the reasons why we would or wouldn't take those risks.
And JD, did you pick up my point on that? That I've realized through this, that's kind of woven into my, say, worldview. I'll say, my living DNA now, that's woven into it.
Yeah.
And this forced me to go, wow, the person who doesn't have this woven in, they have a different thing woven in.
But it's a huge disadvantage. Yeah.
And it actually gives me, like I said, in the right sense, not they're dumb, like it gives me this compassion. It really does. Like, oh, I could understand that. Like if you thought this was it, you would be lock this baby down, don't take any risk. And I love my kids.
Yeah.
I love my kids, my family, my wife, all my friends. I don't want anybody to die,
Yeah, if everything you have is here in this world, you realize how fragile it is.
Yeah.
We should have a lot of compassion and want to show people there's a better way and invite them to experience the kind of peace and security and joy, because the virus can't take any of that from us. And even a corrupt government and, all these consequences that could happen, like even that can't rob us of joy. So I'm telling people in my church, don't be scared of the virus. Don't be scared of a corrupt government or overreach or the loss of liberties. Like we're not scared of that either. Because ultimately we're not living for something in the here and now. That's not ultimate to us, which gives us great freedom.
Very good.
Yeah.
That's great. That's a great word, man.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like that may have just answered my question, but I want to open it for anyone to as we close in on our final words. What would be the exhortation for a Christian leaving this conversation about fragmentation and even connected to it, kind of the non-reason episode where, we dealt a little bit with that, but as a Christian person is thinking about fragmentation, what's the exhortation for them?
Real quick, I would just say, as those who have the message of the gospel, for us to present to people the truth that real wholeness, full integration, requires union with Christ. It's only in Christ that we fully become who we were meant to be. It's only in Christ that we can have the image of God restored and renewed in us. So wholeness and integration and all those pieces coming back together again is something that we cannot do apart from Christ. So I think the human effort to recapture wholeness and coherence apart from Christ is a foolish errand. That will be vanity as well. That leads to emptiness and despair because you can't do it. So I just want to present Christ as both the unifying truth, but also as our only path. Jesus says, I'm the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father. No one can be reconciled with God. No one can be whole spiritually, relationally, except through him. So I want to present Christ to people. And I want to see those evidences of fragmentation as an opportunity, as a problem that's calling out for a solution. And the solution is Christ and his gospel.
Good. JD, I think, if I remember right, I can't remember where my notes are on that, but affirming what you're saying, and I would say the same thing, and maybe we've already said it in here. It's not just that, well, Gabe, this goes to your, in fact, I would love you to chime in quick, Gabe, on this. This goes back to the cake idea and the decoration or the frosting on the cake.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning this, it's not just that we've been given Jesus and salvation. That is true, and it's profound in and of itself. But we've been given an entire way of life in the scriptures, a sanctification, a growth, a whole transformation, like you've said in the beginning, JD. It's a deprogramming as well as it's a new way of looking. So with that said, I would say, if you're watching this and you say, I know Christ, I would secondly say, then look at areas of my life where maybe I haven't thought through a unified whole. I haven't thought through this reality of both of these in one place. Maybe you go to a job that you think is this mundane job, and if only you had a job, a spiritual job, and sat like we do behind books or something and preaching. My point being is, like, where in your life could you look at it going, I've adopted some of this secular fragmentation without even knowing it. Maybe it doesn't feel even emotionally in turmoil for you per se, but it's there. And because that is true for all of us, because we're sinful, we live in a fallen world, we're all going to be in a process of transformation to increasingly see where we're not integrating those things, if you want to say it that way, together properly. And so I have to see it all the time in the way I treat my kids or my life. I walk with the Lord, and I, even just being grumpy in a day over something stupid, I can go, there it is. There, I'm not consistent. I'm not consistent here,
That's the process of sanctification. So, you have in the book of Colossians this exalted view of the supremacy of Christ. And then you have Paul saying, walk in a manner worthy of the Lord. That this reality of the supremacy of Christ touches everything. Yep. And your walk is your life. So every area.
Yep.
So what you guys just described, and this is where it gets tricky, I guess, maybe that's not the right word, but it goes to there's a little bit of truth in the best lies, right? You just described deconstructing your life. Right? You just described, you deconstructed your life, Dan, or what we talked about with the cake, right? You look at every area of that and you deconstruct it and take it apart and rebuild it, or the Spirit helps you rebuild it, right? So we're deconstructing sanctification. They're like that.
Yeah.
It's just what's the end purpose.
The difference is we have a pattern, and the pattern is Christ. So we're not just, it's not a build it your own way.
Right.
Cafeteria thing. There's a pattern, and we're broken now. So the deconstruction is a necessary part of becoming what it was meant to be in the first place.
Correct.
Yeah, that's the thing, Gabe. I would have to challenge you on it just a little bit.
No, I'm not. I'm saying what JD's saying there. Yes, we have to be okay with taking that stuff apart. Where fragmentation or deconstruction today gets abused is there is no pattern.
Right.
There is no historical norm. There is none of that stuff to compare against.
Yeah. And the classic of that was Pruitt. The housing, the public housing in St. Louis, that I forget what year it was. I want to say 74, 78, somewhere in there. They blew it up. They said, okay, it's this experiment of putting up public housing for the inner city is turned into just, a hellhole, a mess. And they just blew the whole thing up. They deconstructed it. That was literally, there are people who would say that was the monumental moment when chronologically we said postmodernity has begun. The problem with it is they didn't offer any alternative. They'd rather everybody be homeless on the streets. They deconstructed it all right. There's no answer. And so, that's my only tension is I'd say, no. I've been given a pattern that I'm to be transformed to. And that's my point. Not only do I have salvation. So Gabe, give me real quick, because you use it with college students all the time. You talk about the cake and the frosting idea. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, we've alluded to this a little bit today. We all grow up in this society or culture, or the water in our aquarium, whatever, right? That molds us and shapes us. And we especially for somebody who's going to be a new convert, right? Maybe who's not raised in the church or doesn't have any of that, or even is raised in the church, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. You have a secular cake, your values, your moralities, the way you live your life, the way you prioritize things, whatever, right? You have a secular cake. And then you find Jesus, and he becomes a frosting on that cake. And nothing inside of the cake, the ingredients, nothing has changed inside you. It's just you have Jesus's love or whatever, right? Put whatever frosting you want on there. And I see that a lot.
Mm. Yeah.
Sprinkle a little Jesus on.
There you go.
Yeah.
And
add him into your life.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I think what we've said the whole episode is yeah, in all reality, you need a new cake. You gotta take the whole thing apart and start from scratch, and that's
use an entirely different recipe.
Yeah. And that's where we are saying, as Christians, that's what we are saying. Like Romans 12 is advocating for deconstructionism. The only difference, and it happens to be enormous, is that we have an eternal authority who is in charge of the reconstruction process. And in Philippians, he says that he is faithful to complete that work. He's going to do it.
So to use biblical terms, biblical Christianity requires repentance.
Yeah.
Recognizing that there's things wrong in me that need to be repudiated and gotten rid of. Biblical ideas like putting to death the deeds of the flesh. That there's and it's a project, an ongoing project that we're involved in, and it's part of the image of God being renewed in us. So it's something that God is at work doing, energizing, guiding. So it's not just a freestyle project we do on our own. But yeah, that's what repentance is. That's what sanctification is repudiating certain things and growing in other areas. That's the work of the Spirit in us.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one thing I think the church needs to realize today, the broad church, right? Or those who are in apologetics or evangelism, whatever, is most of the time when you're talking to somebody on the other side, you're talking to them about their religion, right? It's not a scientific fact or a legal process or anything like that, which I think some of the apologetic stuff leaned more towards in the 80s and 90s, right? It was more material based or law based, a transactional thing. This is really religion on religion now. Yeah. And if you don't recognize that, you're just going to be talking past each other, right? And it's tricky because so much of that new religion out there is just taking bits and pieces of our religion and twisting it, distorting it, which I think we all know where that comes from.
Yeah.
And I think, I agree with you, Gabe. And I'd say the key giveaway is that in that pseudo Christianity is you don't have Christ as supreme. You have self. You have self coming along and dethroning Christ. And then it's got a lot of Christian language and trappings. But ultimately, if you look at worship, that is at the essence of it. That's at the heart of it. So what place does Christ have in a person's life? That's the true measure of really where they're at.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And I think unless anyone else has a final wrap, I would love to put a bow tie on it here. So I think Dan's had enough of me talking about it, but That Hideous Strength is a book written by C.S. Lewis, and really interesting because I had not made this connection until this conversation. But in the age of fragmentation, and coming from the scientific age and whatnot, C.S. Lewis writing this book long time ago, there's a character who is in this scientific organization, and his whole goal is to be a rational person, a rational being, a scientific one, a truly objective person. And they put him in this room of objectivity, and he has to learn to be objective and to ignore his chemical senses, his feelings. And he has to learn to ignore them by imposing upon himself randomness. And so, he would look at paintings that have no purpose or pattern or point. And he would listen to music that was just cacophony of noises. And it had no resolve. And this was all a lesson in objectivity training. And the one who is leading him in this training, in order to finalize it, in order for him to take his official last step, he lays in front of him the crucifix and says, now step on the face of Jesus, as the final piece of his objective training. Because to step on the face of Jesus would be, on the crucified Jesus, would be to finalize your objective fragmentation of being. And, I find in that so much significance. And I think that me wrapping up with this, the encouragement is that to the Christian, I would say, in every conversation you have, like what Gabe was saying, you're approaching someone who is a religious person. And what JD has said in previous episodes, you're approaching someone who has knowledge of the truth, if only they are suppressing it. And I would encourage any Christian listening to this, as you move about your week, both in yourself and with others, lay before them the crucified Jesus and dare them to step on the face of the one who died for them and loves them. And if you're a person watching this who is not a Christian, I would encourage you to try and bring yourself to that point. You know, look at the face of the crucified Jesus who died in love for you, to take the just penalty, and to have to come to terms with that. And if you have to, step on the face of Jesus, you know, in the name of fragmented objectivity in the scientific age, if only that you would actually approach your dilemma head on. And so, I think that's the wrap up, is that in the fragmentation world that comes out of non-reason, that comes out of the scientific age, you know, Jesus is still the stumbling block, and there's just no way around that. And so, that's my encouragement for each person watching this, to find yourself at the feet of the stumbling block and really engage with your dilemma there. And that's it for this episode. I appreciate you watching, and we'll be back with episodes 9 and 10. Those will be our wrap. That's the end of this thing. So, thanks for watching. Have a good rest of your day.